I wanted to say thank you again. Thank you to Mike for hosting us today and doing a class special for the circle. It's really great to have this opportunity to hear from one of the most learned Indiana Jewish history scholars and kind of hear some of what we should know about Indiana Jewish history.
Thank you so much, Dakota, and thank you for helping out so much in putting this together and um, giving us the opportunity to learn about this. I really appreciate that, and hope you guys appreciate this program as well. Um, so I'll start off with beginning of our program tonight, going back to 1724. The reason why I'm going back to 1724 is that is when the what was called the Code Noir was put into place by the French colonies that basically stated that no Jews or African Americans could settle in the French colonies in the Midwest, which consisted of also Indiana. So we know that until the British overtook the French, in the French and Indian Wars that we're pretty certain that no Jews lived in these territories. And anyways, just to put in perspective, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, there were only 2,000 Jews in all of the 13 colonies. So it's unlikely that any Jews lived in Indiana before that period. Um, but I'll go into the next slide here. So instead of focusing on a lot of dates and a lot of people, I'll mention some people, I'll mention some dates, but instead I'll talk about a lot of concepts. And one of the first big concept to understand about Indiana Jewish history is understanding Indiana as an early hub of Jewish migration, particularly the German-speaking Jewish migration that happened in the 1840s and lasted roughly until the 1870s. And so a lot of small towns um, became hubs, small hubs for small groups of Jewish immigrants coming from German-speaking lands. And remember, there wasn't one country of Germany until the 1880s. So we're talking about multiple different groups here, people from Alsace-Lorraine, people from Bavaria, people from Schwabia, different parts that would become Germany in the 1880s. And really, Indiana starts opening up after the Erie Canal is completed. And it's really, you can see the first Jewish communities are really established along the major rivers. And it's not a coincidence that Fort Wayne had the first synagogue because Fort Wayne intersects three different rivers, and these rivers are really important for trade. And so they became important trade routes for Jewish merchants and particularly peddlers who first went down these rivers. And the second Jewish community, if anyone can take a guess, does anyone have a guess where the second Jewish community, the first second synagogue was founded? Does anyone have any guesses? Second synagogue in Indiana, based on this map? I don't have any guesses. Okay, Lafayette.
Worthington? Oh, darn.
Lafayette. So Lafayette, as you can see, also on the Wabash River, also going um, downstream from Fort Wayne. So really, it's Fort Wayne, Lafayette, and Evansville down here. And then you can also see that there were also major. Now, these aren't Jewish communities; these aren't all Jewish communities. But Madison was also a very early Jewish community as well, because it's right on the Ohio River. So you can trace many of the earliest Jewish communities to these various different rivers, and later on, it's the railroads. Um, but what I wanted to say was is that whether it's the Rosenwald family, their son you might know was one of the founders of Sears Roebuck and Company when he was born in Springfield, Illinois. His mother actually grew up in LaPorte, Indiana, and her mother and her father actually lived in Evansville um, before they moved to Springfield, where their son was born, who would eventually found Sears Roebuck and Company. Or you can look at Madison, Indiana, which is where a family called the Brandeis's lived. And the Brandeis's later had a son in Louisville, but they first lived in Madison, Indiana. And that son became the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. So you can see that Indiana was a very important place for early Jewish immigrants before they eventually got to their final destinations in larger cities. They lived in smaller towns. And this was very normal because many German speaking Jews themselves back in Europe lived in villages and small towns. It's very, very common. Um, so this is a timeline. This is also on our website. But really, the first mention that we have, and I'm not going to go all the way through this, don't worry, um, is the first mention that we ever have of a Jew living in Indiana is from 1790, which is actually a legal summons for a Louis Pierre Levy who was living in Vincennes, Indiana. And that is as far back as it goes. We don't know of any other Jews who settled in Indiana before that date, but that is the earliest that we've ever found a document of someone Jewish living in Indiana. Um, and then in 1816, there was a jurist named Samuel Judah who eventually he came from a Sephardic background. His Interestingly enough, his grandfather was actually the first Jew in Canada. Um, and he founded one of the earliest law firm in Indiana, and he eventually became the Speaker of the Indiana House in 1850, and he was the only Jewish Speaker of the Indiana House of Representatives in Indiana's entire history. So Samuel Judah is a really important figure. Um, and really the first Jewish family that lived in Indiana was a family called the Israels, and they changed their name to Johnson of all names, that lived in Connorsville. Um, and they had a child born there in 1819, only a few years after Indiana was founded. And so we're really, until the 1840s, we're only really talking about a handful of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 Jews. And even this Israel Johnson family only lived in Indiana for a few years. The first Jewish family to permanently arrive in Indiana was the Gumberts, who came from Bavaria to Evansville in 1837. Um, and there were a few families, such as the Israel Johnsons and later Moses Falk, who traded with Native Americans. But really, this is quite late because this is pretty close to the Trail of Tears. So uh, if you hear about, this is really after the period that many Native Americans had already sadly been removed and cruelly taken away to the west, to Oklahoma, or killed. So Jews really come at a time in the late 1830s, early 1840s, because of things that are happening in Europe. Um, they don't want to go too far deep into, but they're a combination of push and pull factors, like all immigration is. So a push factor is um, the fact that there are strict marriage laws in like Bavaria. A pull factor might be that there are economic incentives to moving and economic opportunities in the Americas and in Indiana. And the two aren't always mutually exclusive. So people always like to try to divide the two and say, you know, they came more for economic opportunity, or they came more, to have religious freedoms. And sometimes the two aren't always mutually exclusive. Um, but um, basically, American Jewish history has three distinct periods of immigration. And also, this is debated by historians and scholars, but it basically breaks down into the earliest period being the Sephardic period, where Jews from Recife, who were Sephardic, ended up in New Amsterdam, which later became New York, and later Philadelphia and Rhode Island. And then starting in the late 1830s, 1840s, the German-speaking migration that we're talking about earlier, and then later on, um, the largest Jewish migration really in the history of mankind, not just in American history, started in the 1880s onwards with Jews fleeing from Tsarist Russia. Um, so that we'll talk about a bit later. And sometimes people debate when those different migrations started, and sometimes they overlap. But it's important to keep those three different distinct time periods in your mind when you're studying American Jewish history. And then, as I promised earlier, I was going to talk about the Gimbels, which became the biggest retailer in the entire world, and sort of the role that Jews played in developing retail centers all over Indiana and different small towns and different cities. And even in a place like Vincennes, where Adam Gimbel first arrived in Vincennes in 1842, um, I, again, there are stories made up that he traded with Native Americans. Native Americans had already been pushed out of Vincennes before then, so I can assure you that he never traded with Native Americans in Vincennes. Um, but he had a very good reputation as a merchant, and his merchant empire grew and grew and grew, and soon he had a lot of sons, and they moved. Some of them moved to Milwaukee, and some of them moved to Philadelphia, and some of them later moved to New York. And then before you knew it, they had this huge retail empire. So if you've ever watched, well, we're getting into December now, so it's a Wonderful Life. They talk about Gimbels, or if you watch Elf, they talk about Gimbels. So Gimbel, even in episode of The Simpsons, they talk about the Gimbels. So the Gimbels are this huge, cultural, this is in the age of department stores. They even sold the first Slinky ever in history. And they funded a lot of research um, for Indiana School of Medicine and IU's School of Biology. In fact, they even have I believe it's a I don't know if it's a fungus or if it's a bacteria that's named after the Gimbels. So they have their own bacteria named after them for funding IU School of Biology. So yeah, the Gimbels are a really important family, really interesting family, very philanthropic, and they're actually getting their historical marker there in Vincennes, Indiana, next year, next spring, hopefully on Adam Gembel's birthday. Um, so that will be exciting. Um, and then again, if you guys have any questions or anything comes to mind, please ask me questions up in the chat. Um, love to try to answer them. If any of this doesn't make sense or if I'm going too fast, I can certainly slow down. So Indiana, the other major concept I want to leave you with, another one, is that Indiana was really a testing grounds of modern American Judaism. What do I mean by that? Is that, for example, the Minhag America, the first prayer book really exclusively developed in America, um, by Isaac Mayer Wise, was actually tested at Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation months before he used it in his own temple in Cincinnati. And the reason why he did that was that he had such a close relationship with the rabbi there at the time. Um, and he really loved the Indianapolis community. He spoke really like, he had a newspaper called The American Israelite, and imagine a Jewish newspaper was like having a major web blog or having a podcast back then. And he would always ridicule the cities he didn't like, but Indianapolis was one of his favorite cities. So he thought it was a fertile testing ground for his prayer book, for whatever reason, more so than his own community, shockingly. Um, and then you have the Lafayette Jewish community that actually had the first known egalitarian minyan, meaning that women had um, equal, were counted in the minyan. They were allowed to participate in the prayers. And this is something that was totally unheard of in the 1860s. Um, but they wrote to Isaac Mayer Wise. They said, we don't have enough men to have a minyan. Can we allow women to join? And he said, I don't see why not. And so there you have something really groundbreaking in Lafayette, Indiana, which again was the second synagogue established in Indiana. And the funny thing about that was it was actually the first synagogue. This might be the most Hoosier thing ever. It was actually established above a gun shop. So that's a funny fact for you. Um,
Uh,
and and then going to the next part of this, the Adler family. Henry Adler, who was a merchant from Alsace-Lorraine, he was actually Orthodox. He was not Reform, but he was good friends with Isaac Mayer Wise. Actually, gave the first $10,000 to start the Hebrew Union College, the first rabbinical school in America. So if it wasn't for, and he wasn't an extremely wealthy man either, so this made him, kind of an unlikely source of revenue for the first rabbinical school in American history. Um, and then lastly, but not leastly, the Evansville and Indianapolis were some of the first synagogues to join the American Reform movement officially, which was huge because Isaac Mayer Wise needed that in order to raise money for the Hebrew Union College. Um, and some of the first rabbinical school students, by the way, who graduated from there became pulpit rabbis at Indiana, some of Indiana's early synagogues, like Akdu Shalom in Fort Wayne, was started in 1848. Um, and then I'll drop down to here. So the early Indianapolis Jewish community, and by this I mean B'nai B'rith, which was kind of like a fraternal organization, kind of like the Masons or the Shriners, only it was Jewish. Um, they actually wrote a petition to President Grant on behalf of the Romanian Jewish community who were being attacked and being pogromed and being oppressed. And this was actually only the second time in US history that the American government actually spoke out for a Jewish community abroad. The first time was in the 1840s in Damascus with the Damascus blood libel. And the second time was a result of the Indianapolis Jewish community speaking out on behalf of Romanian Jews, which President Grant actually established a liaison to the Romanian government to ensure that they weren't committing atrocities against Jews in Romania. And this is the early 1870s, and this was also a way of General Grant making up for some of the horrible things that he did during the Civil War in Paducah, Kentucky, namely, where he actually had an order that expelled Jews from a whole area of the South. But General Grant, or President Grant, as he was by the 1870s, really wanted to make amends. He was actually the first president to attend a synagogue, to attend Shabbat services. He was also the first president, only the second president ever to um, advocate for Jews abroad. So this was part of that. Now, going back, sorry, I went back a little bit to the Civil War. And really, Indianapolis emerges as an important hub during the Civil War because the rail lines are going through the city. Um, Jews are very involved in the retail sector of Indianapolis, and several of them are producing uniforms for the Union Army, including shoes, hats, and uniforms. Families like the Glazers, which were one of the original founding families of Indianapolis Hebrew congregation. And you see the Jewish population grow to 150,000 in the US from just 50,000 2 decades before. And Indiana actually had one of the highest ranking, um, and he also was also one of the original founders of Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation, General Friedrich Niefler. He was a general in the Union Army, and he went up the ranks, and he, towards the end of his life, was actually one of the people responsible for logistically making the Soldiers and Sailors Monument a reality. So just a wonderful, fascinating person, General Friedrich Niefler. Um, Also, there was a petition from Indiana's Jewish community to President Lincoln for the first rabbinical chaplain. to serve with the Union forces, which is also really interesting because the Union eventually did appoint the first military chaplain during the Civil War. Lincoln finally did that. Um, so going ahead here, one of the things I want to also mention to everyone here is just the normalcy of rural Judaism in Indiana and the normalcy of rural Judaism writ large in American society. So people say, oh, it's so weird how there's a Jewish community in Ligonier, or Madison, or Goshen, Indiana, or LaPorte, or Attica. But really, back then, it wasn't so abnormal to have Jews living in rural areas. And some of these places weren't really, I mean, everything was kind of rural, if you go back to the, 1840s, 1850s, but Madison was actually bigger than Indianapolis at one point. Um, Indianapolis soon caught up with it. Um, but it wasn't strange for Jews to live in rural areas. And like I said earlier, many Jews who came from German speaking backgrounds came from villages where they may have been like one or two Jews living in a village of almost no other Jews. Um, so for them, this arrangement wasn't strange to them at all. It wasn't foreign. And that's one of the things that people really find surprising, because people have this idea that Jews live in very urban or suburban spaces, and that wasn't the norm in the 19th century, and either in Central Europe or in the Americas. And then another thing I want to really um, get across is the importance of scrap metal, particularly for the Jews who came from the Tsarist Empire, this later immigration wave starting in the 1880s. Many Jews worked in scrap metals because this was really the only job they could get. Um, they didn't speak a language that, German speaking Jews had other German speakers they could work with, and Yiddish speakers and Ladino speakers didn't have that. So when they came to a place like Indiana, they needed to have something that they could more or less um, fill a need, a niche that no one else wanted to do. People didn't want to, it was a dirty, unsafe, hard job, but it gave Jews the ability to keep Shabbat if they wanted to, or even kind of create their own business or their own time. That they were working, and they really valued having the ability to kind of control their own, calendar, their own workflow. And so even though this job was really dirty and hard, um, it really helped a lot of Jewish immigrants. In fact, my own family started out with a cart going around Grand Rapids, picking up scrap metal from people. And that's how many other Jews really got their starts in Indiana, all over the state, just picking up scrap metal. And some of them became really large, multi-generational companies, and some of them stayed tiny little, scrap businesses. Um, but really, it's an important part of Indiana's Jewish history. And if you think about it, Gary, Indiana, was really a hub of, there was a constant demand for scrap to go there. And one interesting fact is that Indiana is still today the largest steel producer in the world. So scrap metal has played such an important role in Jewish immigration to Indiana. Um, here's Indianapolis once had a significant kosher industry. A lot of people don't realize that the South Side had multiple Jewish bakeries, at least six different kosher butchers, multiple kosher delis, multiple kosher restaurants in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, all the way until the 1950s, when people discovered that you could start freezing meat, that you didn't have to necessarily have fresh meat. And there was also a lot of tough competition between the different families. And it's also very difficult to run a kosher deli or to run a kosher restaurant. And then also changes in and assimilation obviously played a role in less demand for kosher foods. But at one time, even in the 1980s and 90s, Hebrew National actually relocated to Indianapolis for a period of time and was producing hot dogs in Indianapolis um, until they had a fire, unfortunately, and then later they moved to Michigan. And then here's some interesting figures. There's so many different prominent figures. Just a few I wanted to go over. You can see the picture of David Lee Roth below. And Pearl Berg is actually the oldest living Jewish person in the world. She's 113 years old, and she was born in Evansville, Indiana. Sidney Pollack, the director, actor, um, Minette Baum, who really changed social work and and helped Jewish immigrants in Fort Wayne, and Rabbi David Phillipson, who really, like, he was born in Indiana, but he really took over from Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise and became one of the most important rabbis in the Reform movement in the early 20th century. And then Joshua Bell, of course, who's a famous violinist who lives in Bloomington, Indiana. There's so many different prominent people I could go over. I'm just giving a small sliver of different interesting prominent figures here. Um, and yeah, so that's, I mean, that hard to believe we got through 10 slides. And it's 8 o'clock right now. But I just want to see if I didn't get any questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions for me right now? Let's just open it up right now.
I do, but it's not necessarily related to anything you shared tonight, though I took a lot of notes. It's very interesting. Can I ask a question about something else in possibly Jewish Indiana history?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a public school teacher and very involved in my labor union. I know that the history of public education in Indiana is really difficult because really what led to the formation of public education in Indiana, it wouldn't have come about without the advocacy of the KKK. The KKK was extremely instrumental in getting public schools passed or in the Indiana legislature and getting into the Constitution, largely because they were seeking to exclude people that they didn't want in public schools. So I'm wondering if there's anything you can share about the Jewish community, Indiana Jewish community, and public education. Anything at all that comes to mind?
So yeah, so one of the things that and I need to find the year, I believe it was in the late 1940s, and it was the National Council of Jewish Women, the local chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women. They actually really advocated for integrating school systems in Indianapolis in the late 40s. They also ran, like, I think the first civil rights advocacy day in the late 40s in Indiana. Back to your point about um, the Klan was really, really against parochial schools. They hated the idea of parochial schools because they thought it would put power in the Catholic Church's hands. And really, the Jewish community was afraid to start a Hebrew day school. Like, there was no Jewish community in America that had over 7,000 individuals that didn't have a day school by the 1970s. Indianapolis was the only one that didn't, and it was because people were afraid that it would create anti-Semitism by creating a parochial school. So yeah, the Klan had a lot of unfortunate influence and scared a lot of people even after its demise. Um, whether, and not, the Klan didn't have a role in every part of every bad thing that happened in public education. I want to stress that. Um, but I think you're correct that they did have a nefarious role in it. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, thank you. It's very insightful.
Uh,
Do we have
this is,
more questions?
yeah, this is Anne. I have a couple of links to the things that you've said. First of all, it's been fascinating
Okay.
regarding, let's see, Hebrew National. I was an occupational health nurse there for a little while, and that was my first exposure to koshering on an industrial manufacturing level, which was very interesting. And I was sorry that they did have to close and left. The other interesting fact was about General. You called him Niefler. We called him Neffler. It was on your site that I first found out about General Neffler and his involvement in the Civil War. And it turns out that one of my son's friends is a Neffler, but down through the generations, no longer Jewish. And his friend named Neffler died, unfortunately, at a young age. And my son was given one of the dogs that the boy Neffler had raised, and he named his dog Neffler. And when I saw this post, I sent it to my son, and he said, "Yeah, that is probably the great great grandfather of the Nefflers who lived in Indianapolis somewhere." So uh, your posts have spawned a lot of conversation and
Well,
a lot of interest. So thank you. Are you a historian by education, or is this just a much loved hobby that you do that you know so much?
all the above. So I think that it's interesting about, well, I say Niefler only because that's how my Hungarian colleagues pronounce him. So,
Ah,
but yeah, probably here it probably was kind of anglicized to Neffler. Yeah, the interesting thing about Fred or Friedrich was that his first wife wasn't Jewish, but his second wife was.
ah,
And there's this whole controversy that erupted whether he had actually left Judaism or not. And I have never seen any real evidence that he ever left Judaism. And I think a lot of it came about because of a general from the 1930s and 40s named Maurice Rose, who did convert to Christianity. And so a lot because of that present controversy, some of it kind of spilled into started quite well, was Niefler actually, did he actually
ah,
convert away? He never converted away from Judaism. To the best of my knowledge, um, he sort of became a secularist. He sort of was in those kind of circles of the free thinkers, people that we would think of as probably, secularists or atheists or agnostics. Although, because of the public nature of being a general, he couldn't really like say, yeah, that's how I think. But it kind of comes across in sort of sarcastic wit that he has when he was a general. During the Civil War, they brought a Christian chaplain up, and he said, you GDU. He
ah,
used a few explicit and deleted. You better list this chapel and the good God sent him to you, So
wow.
he didn't take religion that seriously, um, in either case. And I just find that so fascinating that, you have someone who could never reach the rank of general in his own native country in Hungary who becomes a general in the Union Army. It's just absolutely incredible. And he's able to, um, use comedy and humor and make fun of, a Christian chaplain. And people are, they just respected him because he was this amazing officer in logistics and combat. And he really went up the ranks. And Governor Morton actually had him replace um, Lew Wallace. Now think about this. Lew Wallace is the son of
Yeah,
a governor. Okay, he's
yeah.
this very famous, well-connected. Here's a Jewish immigrant who replaces Lew Wallace because Governor Morton sees General Friedrich Niefler, or not General yet, Colonel Niefler, as being more competent. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. Um, so yeah, so I could go on and on and on about Friedrich Niefler like for hours. So let's yep. If you have other
I
questions,
will
I can answer those.
I will share this with my son for more fascinating notes on
Sure, there's so many
the art of
interesting
Jewry.
Friedrich Niefler stories I can share with you. General Niefler is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Any other questions here? we're not getting any other questions.
You
Anything-
mentioned
go ahead.
David Lee Roth. What is David Lee Roth's connection? I can't read the.
He was
It's
born in
too small.
Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm trying. I
Oh,
think he grew up in Newcastle, something like that. I think he grew up in Newcastle, but he was definitely born in Bloomington. And so yeah, he's definitely born here, and he's definitely Jewish. So there you go.
oh,
He's probably the most famous Jewish celebrity ever from Indiana that I can think of. Um, besides Sidney Pollock's also pretty famous, but I think David Lee Roth is more famous.
hmm. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions here? Well, it's starting to get a bit late here. Now, if you do have questions that come to mind or concerns or anything you want to know about, or maybe something else pops up in your head, feel free to email me, Michael, like Michael Jordan .brown, like the color, at ijhs.org. That is our domain name. Or you can go to the In Jewish History podcast to do a deeper dive into some of the topics that we talked about, such as scrap metals and recycling, or talking about some of the other educational issues that we talked about earlier. Love to hear from you guys and stay in contact with everybody. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Definitely, for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Dakota, thank you for arranging this so nicely for us.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming, everyone.
All right, take care. Have a great week. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.